Dr. Ryan Foster adjusted his rearview mirror one last time before stepping out of his car in the university parking lot. He had no way of knowing that Officer Ethan Sanders had been watching him for the past 3 weeks, waiting for this exact moment. What happened next would be captured by 14 different campus security cameras, but Sanders didn't know that yet. He thought he was invisible, untouchable, and about to destroy another black man's life with a small plastic baggie he'd been carrying in his pocket for months. Which state are you from? Have you ever witnessed someone being set up for a crime they didn't commit? What would you do if your entire reputation could be destroyed by someone else's lie? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine campus of Millbrook University, where Dr. Ryan Foster had taught molecular biology for 12 years. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned his place in the world through intellect, dedication, and an unwavering belief that facts always triumph over fiction. His navy blue blazer was perfectly pressed, his leather briefcase contained student midterm exams that needed grading, and his silver Honda Civic represented the practical choice of a professor who preferred spending money on research equipment rather than luxury cars. Ryan had no reason to suspect that his routine Tuesday departure from campus would be anything other than ordinary. He gathered his papers, locked his office door, and walked through the familiar corridors of the science building, where his colleagues nodded respectfully and students greeted him with genuine warmth. Dr. Foster was the kind of professor who made complex molecular structures seem elegant, who stayed late to help struggling students, and who had published 17 peer-reviewed papers that advanced human understanding of cellular biology. 3 weeks earlier, Officer Ethan Sanders had first spotted Dr. Foster's car in this same parking lot. Sanders was driving patrol through the university district when he noticed the silver Honda with its pristine exterior and faculty parking sticker. Something about the sight irritated him. A black man driving a decent car, parking in a space reserved for professors, walking with the kind of confidence that suggested he belonged there. Sanders had pulled his patrol car to the side of the road and watched through binoculars as Dr. Foster emerged from the vehicle wearing a suit that cost more than Sanders made in a week. That first observation had planted a seed of resentment that grew into something darker over the following days. Sanders began timing his patrols to coincide with Dr. Foster's schedule. He learned that the professor typically left campus between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, that he drove the speed limit religiously, and that he represented everything Sanders believed was wrong with the current state of society. Here was a black man who had achieved success, respect, and authority in a world where Sanders felt increasingly marginalized and overlooked. Sanders was 36 years old and had been stuck at the same rank for 8 years. His promotion reviews consistently cited his aggressive approach to policing and his inability to build community trust. His arrest numbers were adequate, but not exceptional, and his supervisors had made it clear that advancement required more than just meeting quotas. Sanders interpreted these evaluations as evidence of reverse discrimination, convinced that his race was holding him back while men like Dr. Foster were given opportunities they didn't deserve. The plan had crystallized. 2 weeks into Sanders' surveillance, he would plant evidence on Dr. Foster, conduct a traffic stop, and make an arrest that would generate positive statistics for his performance review. The drugs had come from the evidence locker of a case that had been dismissed on a technicality. Sanders had volunteered to transport the evidence for destruction, but instead of following protocol, he had pocketed a small bag of cocaine that would serve his purposes perfectly. Sanders chose cocaine specifically because it carried serious penalties and would effectively destroy Dr. Foster's academic career. A drug conviction would result in immediate termination from the university, loss of research funding, and permanent damage to his professional reputation. Sanders had researched the university's disciplinary policies and knew that even an arrest would trigger an internal investigation that could take months to resolve. For 3 weeks, Sanders had practiced the scenario in his mind. He would approach the car while Dr. Foster was in his office, plant the evidence in the glove compartment, and then conduct a routine traffic stop a few blocks from campus. When he inevitably found the drugs during a search, Sanders would appear to be doing his job professionally, while destroying a man he had decided didn't deserve the life he had built. The campus surveillance system that would ultimately expose Sanders' crime was a state-of-the-art network installed after a series of campus security incidents 3 years earlier. 14 high-definition cameras covered the faculty parking lot from multiple angles, recording continuously to digital storage systems that retained footage for 90 days. The cameras were so well integrated into the campus landscape that most people forgot they existed, which was exactly their intended design. Dr. Foster checked his watch as he walked across the parking lot toward his car. He had a faculty meeting at 5:30 and needed to drop his graded exams at his office before heading home to prepare his lecture notes for tomorrow's advanced cellular biology class. His mind was occupied with the elegant complexity of mitochondrial DNA replication, a topic he would be presenting to graduate students the following morning. Sanders watched from his concealed position behind a maintenance building, his heart rate elevated with anticipation and anxiety. He had timed this moment perfectly. Dr. Foster would be in his office for approximately 15 minutes, providing enough time to plant the evidence and retreat to a safe distance. Sanders checked his surroundings one final time, confirming that no pedestrians were visible in the immediate area. The irony of the situation was lost on Sanders completely. He was about to frame a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth through scientific method, using fabricated evidence that would be contradicted by multiple forms of documentation that Sanders didn't even know existed. Dr. Foster's meticulous nature extended to every aspect of his life, including his habit of photographing his car's interior before leaving it unattended in public spaces, a practice he had adopted after a previous vehicle break-in several years earlier. As Dr. Foster disappeared into the science building, Sanders emerged from his hiding place and approached the silver Honda with practiced casualness. He wore latex gloves under the pretense of standard police procedure, though his real motivation was avoiding fingerprint evidence. Sanders had studied the car's exterior during his surveillance and knew that Dr. Foster typically left it unlocked during brief campus visits, trusting in the university's security measures. The car door opened smoothly, and Sanders slid into the driver's seat with the confidence of someone who believed he was committing the perfect crime. He reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small plastic bag containing approximately 2 grams of cocaine, an amount that would qualify as possession with intent to distribute under state law. Sanders placed the bag carefully in the glove compartment, positioning it so that it would be easily visible during a search, but not so obviously placed that it would appear to have been planted. Sanders took a moment to survey the car's interior, noting the academic journals on the passenger seat, the university parking permits, and the general tidiness that suggested an organized mind. Everything about the vehicle reinforced Sanders' resentment toward Dr. Foster's apparent success and stability. Sanders imagined the professor's shock when the drugs were discovered, the humiliation of being arrested in front of his colleagues, and the satisfaction of proving that even the most respected members of society could be brought down. What Sanders failed to notice during his brief time in the car was the small recording device that Dr. Foster had installed after the previous break-in, a virtually invisible camera that activated automatically when the car door opened. The device was designed to record both audio and video, capturing clear evidence of anyone who entered the vehicle without authorization. Sanders also missed the GPS tracking system that logged every instance of the car door being opened, creating a digital timestamp that would later prove crucial to establishing the timeline of his crime. Sanders exited the vehicle and closed the door carefully, checking once more to ensure that he had left no obvious signs of his presence. He walked back toward his concealed position with the same casual pace he had used in approaching, confident that he had just set in motion a chain of events that would advance his career while destroying Dr. Foster's life. The 14 campus security cameras had recorded Sanders' entire operation from multiple angles, capturing high-definition footage of his approach, his entry into the vehicle, and his departure. The university security system automatically flagged unusual activity in the faculty parking lot, though the alert would not be reviewed until the following morning during routine security briefings. Dr. Foster completed his office tasks and returned to his car exactly 17 minutes after Sanders had planted the evidence. He loaded his briefcase into the passenger seat, started the engine, and began the short drive toward the campus exit, where Sanders was waiting in his patrol car. Dr. Foster's mind was still focused on his upcoming faculty meeting and the molecular biology lecture he needed to prepare, completely unaware that his life was about to change dramatically. Sanders positioned his patrol car strategically at the intersection where Dr. Foster would exit the campus, a location that provided clear justification for conducting a traffic stop while ensuring maximum visibility for any witnesses. Sanders wanted this arrest to be as public and humiliating as possible, believing that the spectacle would enhance the psychological impact on Dr. Foster while demonstrating Sanders' effectiveness to his supervisors. As Dr. Foster's Honda approached the intersection, Sanders activated his emergency lights and pulled into traffic behind the professor's vehicle. The traffic stop that followed would set in motion a series of events that neither man could have anticipated, leading to an investigation that would expose not just Sanders' crime, but a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond a single rogue officer's vendetta against a successful black academic. Dr. Foster checked his rearview mirror and felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach as he noticed the police lights behind him. He had committed no traffic violations and could think of no reason why he would be stopped. But 12 years of driving while black had taught him that logic and justice were not always aligned in encounters with law enforcement. He pulled over to the shoulder of the road and began the careful ritual of compliance that he hoped would ensure his safety. Sanders approached Dr. Foster's vehicle with manufactured authority, his hand resting on his service weapon in a gesture designed to intimidate rather than protect. He had rehearsed this encounter dozens of times in his mind, anticipating every possible response from Dr. Foster and preparing explanations that would justify his actions to any witnesses or supervisors who might question his methods. The next few minutes would determine whether Sanders' plan succeeded in destroying an innocent man's life, or whether the truth would emerge through the very technology and evidence-based thinking that Dr. Foster had spent his career championing. The irony that a molecular biologist who specialized in analyzing complex data would become the victim of fabricated evidence was about to collide with the reality that his scientific approach to life had prepared him better than Sanders realized for the battle that lay ahead. Dr. Ryan Foster sat motionless in his driver's seat, both hands visible on the steering wheel, as Officer Ethan Sanders approached his window. The afternoon sun created a harsh glare on the windshield, but Foster could see Sanders' deliberate predatory movements in his side mirror. This wasn't the casual stride of routine law enforcement. This was the calculated approach of someone who had already decided how this encounter would end. Sanders tapped on the driver's window with his knuckles, a sharp sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have in the quiet residential street near campus. When Foster rolled down the window, Sanders immediately positioned himself so that his body blocked any view from passing vehicles, creating an isolated pocket of authority where only his version of events would matter. "License and registration," Sanders commanded, without offering any explanation for the stop. His voice carried the flat, authoritative tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance, but there was something else beneath it, an eagerness that Foster couldn't quite identify, but that made his skin crawl with unease. Foster reached carefully into his jacket pocket, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any actions that could be misinterpreted as threatening. "Officer, may I ask why you stopped me? I don't believe I was speeding or committed any traffic violations." His voice remained calm and respectful, though internally he was running through every possible reason for this encounter and finding none that made sense. Sanders examined the documents with exaggerated thoroughness, holding them up to the light and comparing the photo to Foster's face with theatrical suspicion. "Dr. Ryan Foster," he read aloud, emphasizing the title with barely concealed contempt. "Fancy title for someone driving through this neighborhood. What brings a professor to this part of town?" The question was designed to be insulting, implying that Foster didn't belong in the area, despite the fact that they were still within a mile of the university campus where Foster worked. "I'm leaving campus after office hours," Foster replied evenly. "I teach molecular biology at Millbrook University." Sanders nodded slowly, as if processing this information for the first time, though he had been researching Foster's background for weeks. "Molecular biology, that sounds expensive. Must pay well." The comment hung in the air like an accusation, suggesting that Foster's success was somehow suspicious or undeserved. "I've been fortunate in my career," Foster responded, refusing to be drawn into defending his accomplishments to a police officer who had no legitimate reason to question them. Sanders stepped back from the window and made a show of walking around the vehicle, examining the exterior with the same exaggerated attention he had given to Foster's identification. He was building a case for reasonable suspicion, creating a narrative that would justify the search he was about to conduct. Sanders knew that his body camera was recording, and he was careful to perform for an audience that would eventually review his actions. "Dr. Foster, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Sanders announced when he returned to the driver's window. "I've observed some concerning indicators that suggest possible involvement in illegal activity." Foster felt his heart rate spike, but he maintained his composure. "What indicators, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." Even as he asked the question, Foster was calculating the risks of compliance versus resistance. His legal knowledge told him that he had the right to refuse a search without a warrant, but his practical experience as a black man in America told him that asserting his rights could escalate the situation dangerously. Nervous behavior, evasive answers, expensive vehicle, inconsistent with stated profession, Sanders listed with practiced efficiency. Each reason was subjective enough to be legally defensible, while being specific enough to sound legitimate to casual observers. "Please step out of the vehicle now, sir." Foster opened his car door slowly and stood beside his Honda, his hands visible at all times. He was acutely aware of being in the open now, exposed and vulnerable in a way that sitting in his car had shielded him from. The late afternoon traffic was light, but several cars had slowed as they passed, their drivers craning their necks to observe the spectacle of a well-dressed black man being detained by police. Sanders positioned Foster against the rear of the vehicle and began a pat-down search that was more aggressive than necessary for a routine traffic stop. The officer's hands were rough and invasive, clearly intended to humiliate as much as to search for weapons. "Dr. Foster, I hope you understand that I'm just doing my job here. Sometimes people aren't who they appear to be." The comment was loaded with implications about Foster's character and legitimacy, suggesting that his professional success was a facade hiding criminal activity. Foster remained silent during the search, focusing on breathing steadily and maintaining his dignity in a situation designed to strip both away from him. "I'm going to search your vehicle now," Sanders announced, though it was not a request. "Based on my observations and experience, I have reasonable suspicion that this vehicle may contain evidence of illegal activity." Foster knew he had the right to refuse, but he also knew that Sanders would interpret any assertion of his constitutional rights as confirmation of guilt. "Officer, I don't consent to a search of my vehicle. I haven't committed any crime, and I would like to contact my attorney." Sanders smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "You have the right to refuse, Dr. Foster, but your suspicious behavior and nervous demeanor give me reasonable articulable suspicion to conduct a safety search of areas within your immediate control." The legal justification was thin, but Sanders was betting that Foster wouldn't challenge it in court, especially after what Sanders was about to discover. The officer opened the passenger door and began searching the interior with theatrical thoroughness, checking under seats, in door pockets, and finally reaching toward the glove compartment where he had planted the cocaine 3 hours earlier. Foster watched helplessly as Sanders opened the glove compartment and immediately recoiled in apparent surprise. Well, what do we have here?" Sanders' voice carried a tone of vindicated suspicion, as if his professional instincts had led him to an inevitable discovery. Sanders withdrew the small plastic bag containing white powder, holding it up so that Foster could see it clearly. "Dr. Foster, can you explain why there are illegal narcotics in your vehicle?" The world seemed to stop moving for Foster in that moment. He stared at the bag in Sanders's hand, his mind racing through the impossibility of what he was seeing. He had never used illegal drugs, never purchased them, never even been in the presence of them, outside of academic discussions about their molecular structures. The cocaine in Sanders's hand might as well have been a unicorn for all the sense its presence in his car made. "That's not mine," Foster said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have never seen that before in my life. I don't use drugs. I don't buy drugs. I don't know how that got in my car." Sanders nodded with mock sympathy, as if he had heard similar protestations countless times before. "Dr. Foster, I understand this is upsetting, but I have to place you under arrest for possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. The quantity of cocaine Sanders had planted was carefully calculated to exceed the threshold for simple possession, automatically elevating the charges to a felony level that would have devastating consequences for Foster's career and reputation. Sanders reached for his handcuffs, savoring the moment he had been anticipating for weeks. "You have the right to remain silent," Sanders began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of the Miranda warning he had delivered hundreds of times before. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Foster felt the cold metal of the handcuffs close around his wrists, the click of the mechanism sounding like the door of his career being slammed shut. He was experiencing the surreal disconnection of watching his life be destroyed by someone else's deliberate malice, powerless to stop a process that seemed to have its own unstoppable momentum. "You have the right to an attorney," Sanders continued, though his tone suggested that this right was more theoretical than practical. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." As Sanders guided Foster toward the patrol car, the professor's mind was already working through the implications of what was happening. His teaching schedule would be disrupted, his research projects would be suspended, and his colleagues would learn of his arrest within hours. The university's policies regarding faculty misconduct were clear and unforgiving. Even an arrest for drug possession would trigger an immediate investigation that could last months. Sanders opened the rear door of his patrol car and placed his hand on Foster's head as he guided him into the back seat, a gesture that appeared protective but was actually designed to demonstrate control. Foster found himself sitting in a cage of metal mesh and bulletproof glass, separated from the front seat by barriers that transformed him from a respected academic into a criminal suspect in the span of minutes. The patrol car's camera system was recording everything, creating what Sanders believed would be compelling evidence of a routine drug arrest conducted by the book. Sanders had been careful to follow proper procedures throughout the encounter, creating a paper trail that would support his version of events while concealing the fact that he had manufactured the evidence that justified the arrest. Sanders completed his paperwork with methodical precision, documenting the time and location of the stop, the reasons for conducting the search, and the discovery of the narcotics. His report would become the official record of the incident, a document that would be reviewed by prosecutors, defense attorneys, and university administrators as they determined Foster's fate. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Foster stared out the rear window at his Honda Civic, which would be impounded and searched more thoroughly at the police station. He was already thinking like the scientist he was, analyzing the situation with the same systematic approach he used to solve complex molecular problems. Something about this arrest felt orchestrated, too convenient, too perfectly timed to be the result of random police work. Sanders glanced in his rearview mirror at his prisoner, feeling a satisfaction that he hadn't experienced in years. He had successfully executed his plan, removed a symbol of everything he resented about modern society, and advanced his own career in the process. Sanders was already mentally composing the commendation letter he hoped his supervisor would write, praising his initiative and investigative skills in making a significant drug arrest. The drive to the police station took 12 minutes through downtown traffic. 12 minutes during which Foster's life transformed from stable academic success to criminal defendant facing serious felony charges. The irony that a man who had dedicated his career to understanding complex molecular structures was being destroyed by a simple bag of cocaine wasn't lost on Foster, though he couldn't yet see how that same scientific mindset would eventually expose the truth behind his arrest. Sanders parked at the police station and began the process of transferring Foster from the patrol car to the booking facility, a procedure that would be captured by multiple security cameras and witnessed by numerous officers and staff members. The arrest was becoming public record now, creating a paper trail that would be impossible to erase, regardless of how the case ultimately resolved. Foster's booking photo would be taken within the hour, a mugshot that would potentially follow him for the rest of his career, regardless of the eventual outcome of his case. The university's Human Resources Department would be notified of his arrest before the end of the business day, triggering administrative procedures that could result in his suspension even before any criminal proceedings began. Sanders completed the arrest paperwork, with professional efficiency, though internally he was celebrating the successful execution of his plan. He had planted evidence, conducted a search, made an arrest, and created documentation that would support a conviction while concealing his own criminal behavior. Sanders believed he had committed the perfect crime, one that would never be discovered because the victim would be too destroyed to fight back effectively. The plastic bag of cocaine that had begun this entire ordeal was now logged into evidence, sealed, and tagged with case numbers that would follow it through the criminal justice system. Sanders had no way of knowing that the university's security cameras had recorded his planting of that same evidence, or that Foster's methodical nature had created additional documentation that would eventually expose the frame-up. As Foster was processed through the booking system, his colleagues at the university were finishing their regular Tuesday afternoon activities, unaware that one of their most respected faculty members was sitting in a jail cell, facing charges that could end his career and destroy his reputation. The academic world that Foster had worked so hard to succeed in was about to learn that even distinguished professors were not immune to the kind of criminal allegations that could unravel a lifetime of achievement in a matter of hours. Sanders drove home that evening, feeling more satisfied with his work than he had in years, convinced that he had solved a personal problem while demonstrating his value as a police officer. He had no way of knowing that the very technology he had dismissed during his planning would soon expose his crime and transform him from hunter to hunted in a case that would eventually make national headlines. The fluorescent lights in the county jail booking facility hummed with a mechanical persistence that seemed designed to prevent sleep or peaceful thought. Dr. Ryan Foster sat on a narrow metal bench in a holding cell, still wearing his navy blazer, though it was now wrinkled from the booking process. The reality of his situation was settling in with the slow, crushing weight of a landslide. He was facing felony drug charges that could destroy everything he had spent his adult life building. Foster's academic mind refused to accept the impossibility of what had happened. As a scientist, he understood that every effect had a cause, every result had a methodology, and every conclusion required verifiable evidence. The cocaine in his glove compartment violated every principle of logical causation he had spent his career studying. Someone had put it there deliberately, but proving that fact would require the same systematic approach he used to solve complex molecular problems. The booking process had been humiliating in ways Foster hadn't anticipated. His fingerprints were recorded in digital databases that would link him forever to this arrest, regardless of the eventual outcome. His mugshot captured the bewildered expression of a man whose orderly world had been shattered by malicious fabrication. The property inventory included his wedding ring, his university ID badge, and the leather briefcase containing student exams that he was supposed to return tomorrow. Foster's one phone call had gone to his wife, Dr. Elena Foster, a cardiovascular surgeon at City General Hospital. The conversation had been brief and devastating. Elena's initial disbelief had given way to practical concern as she grasped the implications of his arrest. She would contact their family attorney, notify Foster's department chair, and begin the process of managing a crisis that threatened both their careers and their family's stability. 20 minutes after Foster's arrest became official record, the automated notification system at Millbrook University flagged the incident for administrative review. The university's risk management protocol required immediate notification when faculty members were arrested for felony charges, triggering a chain reaction that would spread through the academic community within hours. Dean Patricia Hawthorne received the notification on her smartphone while attending a fundraising dinner for the university's new research facility. She excused herself from the table and stepped into the hotel lobby to process the information she was reading. Dr. Ryan Foster, one of the molecular biology department's most respected professors, had been arrested for possession of cocaine with intent to distribute. The charges were serious enough to mandate immediate administrative action. Hawthorne's first call was to the university's legal counsel, Sandra Martinez, who was equally shocked by the news. Foster had no disciplinary history, no substance abuse issues, and no previous involvement with law enforcement. His research grants were current, his teaching evaluations were consistently excellent, and his publication record was impeccable. Nothing in his professional profile suggested someone who would be involved with illegal drugs. "We'll need to convene an emergency review committee," Martinez advised over the phone. University policy requires suspension pending investigation for any faculty member charged with drug-related felonies. It's mandatory, regardless of our personal opinions about Dr. Foster's character. The university's crisis management team assembled in the administration building at 8 o'clock that evening, 3 hours after Foster's arrest. The meeting included Dean Hawthorne, Legal Counsel Martinez, Human Resources Director Robert Chen, and Public Relations Director Amanda Sullivan. They faced the unpleasant task of protecting the university's reputation while determining how to handle one of their most valued faculty members. "The charges are serious," Chen observed as he reviewed the police report that had been faxed to his office. "Possession with intent to distribute carries a potential sentence of 5 to 10 years. Even if Dr. Foster is ultimately cleared, the investigation process could take months." Sullivan was already anticipating the media attention that would follow once news of the arrest became public. Foster has been quoted in several national publications about his research. If this story gains traction, it could damage our entire science department's reputation. We need to get ahead of the narrative. Martinez reviewed the university's faculty handbook, confirming the policies that would govern their response. "We have no choice but to place him on administrative suspension, effective immediately. He'll retain his salary and benefits during the investigation, but he cannot teach, conduct research, or represent the university in any capacity." The decision was painful, but legally necessary. Foster's classes would need to be reassigned, his research projects would be suspended, and his graduate students would be transferred to other advisors. The ripple effects of his arrest would disrupt dozens of academic and research programs that depended on his expertise and leadership. Dean Hawthorne volunteered to personally notify Foster's department colleagues, a conversation she dreaded but couldn't delegate. The molecular biology faculty had worked together for years, and many of them considered Foster not just a colleague but a friend. The news would shatter their confidence in the predictability and fairness of their professional world. Meanwhile, Officer Ethan Sanders was completing his shift paperwork with unusual attention to detail. The arrest report he submitted would become the foundation for prosecutorial decisions about Foster's case, and Sanders wanted to ensure that every detail supported the narrative of a routine traffic stop that uncovered serious criminal activity. Sanders' supervisor, Sergeant Michael Torres, reviewed the arrest report with the satisfaction of someone whose unit statistics were improving. Drug arrests were valuable metrics for departmental performance evaluations, and Sanders' work represented exactly the kind of proactive policing that generated positive attention from city administrators. "Good work, Sanders," Torres commented as he signed off on the paperwork. "Clean arrest, proper procedures, significant quantity. The district attorney's office should have no trouble getting a conviction on this one." Sanders accepted the praise with appropriate professional modesty, though internally he was savoring the validation of his planning and execution. He had successfully framed an innocent man while enhancing his own reputation within the department. The arrest would strengthen his case for promotion while permanently damaging Foster's life and career. The local media received notification of Foster's arrest through routine monitoring of police booking records. Crime reporters maintained contacts within the police department who provided tips about unusual or noteworthy arrests. And a university professor charged with drug trafficking was exactly the kind of story that generated reader interest. Jennifer Walsh, a veteran crime reporter for the Metro Herald, received a text message about the arrest while reviewing court documents for another story. She immediately recognized Foster's name from previous articles about university research and realized that this arrest represented a significant local news story. Walsh began making phone calls to confirm details and gather additional information. The police department's public information officer provided basic facts about the arrest, while university contacts confirmed Foster's employment and academic standing. The contrast between Foster's professional reputation and the serious criminal charges created a compelling narrative that would attract significant public attention. Foster's colleagues in the molecular biology department learned of his arrest through a hastily convened faculty meeting called by Dean Hawthorne for 9 o'clock that evening. The dozen professors who gathered in the conference room expected to discuss routine administrative matters, not the criminal charges against one of their most respected colleagues. Dr. Margaret Walsh, Foster's closest collaborator on several research projects, felt physically ill as Hawthorne explained the situation. "There must be some mistake," she insisted. "Ryan doesn't even drink alcohol regularly. The idea that he would be involved with cocaine is absolutely impossible." Dr. James Richardson, who had worked with Foster for 8 years, echoed Walsh's disbelief. "This doesn't make sense. Ryan is one of the most ethical people I know. He won't even accept pharmaceutical company gifts because he thinks they create conflicts of interest. Something is very wrong here." The faculty's unanimous support for Foster created an awkward dynamic for the administrative officials who were required to follow university policy, regardless of their personal opinions. Dean Hawthorne found herself in the position of defending policies she privately questioned while managing colleagues who viewed the suspension as a betrayal of their friend. "I understand your concerns," Hawthorne said carefully, "but we have legal obligations that supersede our personal relationships. Dr. Foster will have every opportunity to defend himself, but until these charges are resolved, we must follow established procedures." Foster's graduate students learned of his arrest through unofficial channels before any formal notification from the university. The academic grapevine carried news faster than administrative communications, and by 10 o'clock that evening, speculation and rumors were spreading throughout the science building. Sarah Chen, Foster's doctoral advisee, was working late in the laboratory when she received a text message from a friend in another department. The news that her advisor had been arrested for drug trafficking was so unexpected that she initially dismissed it as a mistake or a malicious rumor. Foster had been a mentor and inspiration throughout her graduate studies, and the idea that he was involved in criminal activity contradicted everything she knew about his character. Chen called Foster's office number and heard his voicemail message, recorded in the calm, professional tone she had heard thousands of times over the past 3 years. The message asked callers to leave detailed information about their inquiry and promised a response within 24 hours. Chen hung up without speaking, realizing that her advisor might not be returning calls for months or possibly years. The ripple effects of Foster's arrest extended beyond the university into the broader scientific community, where his research was respected and frequently cited. Colleagues at other institutions who learned of the charges through professional networks struggled to reconcile the criminal allegations with their knowledge of Foster's work and reputation. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a molecular biologist at State University who had collaborated with Foster on several publications, received a phone call from a mutual colleague seeking confirmation of the news. Rodriguez found herself defending someone she knew primarily through professional interactions, trying to explain why the charges seemed inconsistent with everything she knew about his scientific approach and personal ethics. Foster's arrest also triggered automatic reviews of his research grants and ongoing projects. Federal funding agencies required notification when principal investigators faced serious criminal charges, beginning administrative processes that could result in suspension or termination of financial support. The National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health would conduct their own investigations parallel to the criminal proceedings. The potential loss of research funding represented millions of dollars that supported not only Foster's work, but also the salaries of research assistants, the purchase of laboratory equipment, and the continuation of studies that could lead to medical breakthroughs. The arrest of one professor threatened to disrupt scientific progress that extended far beyond his individual contributions. As midnight approached, Foster remained in his holding cell, unable to sleep on the narrow metal bench that served as his bed. He had never been inside a jail before, and the sounds of the facility, metal doors clanging, guards walking through corridors, other prisoners talking or crying, created an atmosphere of institutional despair that seemed designed to break human spirits. Foster's scientific mind was already working on the problem of proving his innocence, though he lacked access to the evidence and technology that would eventually expose Sanders' crime. He knew that cocaine didn't materialize spontaneously in glove compartments, and he was beginning to suspect that his arrest was the result of deliberate targeting rather than random police work. Sanders, meanwhile, was sleeping peacefully in his own bed, satisfied with a day's work that he believed had improved both his professional standing and the moral order of his community. He had no reason to suspect that the very surveillance technology he had ignored during his planning would soon transform him from successful perpetrator to exposed criminal. The overnight hours brought additional developments as news of Foster's arrest spread through digital networks and social media platforms. Former students, research colleagues, and community members who knew Foster began expressing disbelief and support through online forums and messaging systems. The contrast between the criminal charges and public knowledge of Foster's character was creating a narrative of injustice that would eventually attract national attention. By dawn, Foster's arrest had generated its first news coverage, a brief online article that reported the basic facts while noting the unusual nature of drug charges against a respected university professor. The story would be updated throughout the day as reporters gathered additional information and public interest in the case continued to grow. The university's public relations department prepared talking points for media inquiries, emphasizing the institution's commitment to proper procedures while avoiding any statements that might prejudice Foster's case. The delicate balance between protecting the university's reputation and supporting a faculty member required careful navigation of legal and ethical considerations. Foster's wife Elena had spent the night consulting with their family attorney and beginning the process of assembling a defense team capable of handling serious felony charges. She knew that her husband's career and their family's future depended on proving his innocence, a task that would require significant financial resources and legal expertise. The attorney, Marcus Williams, specialized in criminal defense and had handled several cases involving professional clients facing career-ending charges. His initial review of the police report identified several questions about the circumstances of Foster's arrest, though proving misconduct would require access to evidence that might not be readily available. As the sun rose over Millbrook University, the campus began another day that would be forever changed by the events of the previous afternoon. Foster's empty office, his canceled classes, and his suspended research projects represented visible reminders that even the most accomplished professionals were vulnerable to accusations that could destroy decades of achievement. The story of Dr. Ryan Foster's arrest was just beginning, though neither he nor Officer Sanders yet understood how technology, community support, and systematic investigation would ultimately determine which man's version of events would be believed by the justice system they both hoped would vindicate their actions. The morning security briefing at Millbrook University began at 7 o'clock sharp, just as it had every weekday for the past 5 years. Chief of Campus Security David Thompson gathered his team in the small conference room adjacent to the central monitoring station, where banks of screens displayed feeds from the university's extensive surveillance network. None of them expected that this routine meeting would uncover evidence of a crime that would make national headlines. Security Officer Lisa Martinez was reviewing the overnight activity log when she noticed the automated flag generated by unusual movement in Faculty Lot C during the previous afternoon. The university's AI-enhanced surveillance system was programmed to identify patterns that deviated from normal campus activity, and the presence of an unidentified individual near vehicles during class hours had triggered a low-priority alert. "Chief, we've got a flag from yesterday afternoon," Martinez announced, pulling up the relevant footage on her workstation. Someone who wasn't a faculty member or student was observed in the parking lot around the time Dr. Foster would have been in his office. Thompson moved to Martinez's workstation and observed the timestamp on the footage, 4:17 p.m., exactly when Dr. Foster's arrest would occur, less than an hour later. The coincidence was troubling enough to warrant closer examination, especially given the unusual nature of the charges against one of the university's most respected professors. "Let's see what we've got," Thompson said, settling into a chair beside Martinez as she began scrolling through the relevant camera feeds. The footage began with wide shots of Faculty Lot C during a quiet afternoon period when most professors were in their offices or classrooms. Cars sat motionless in numbered spaces and pedestrian traffic was minimal. Then, at 4:11 p.m., a figure appeared at the edge of the frame, a man in a police uniform moving with deliberate purpose toward a silver Honda Civic. Martinez enhanced the zoom on the relevant camera feed and immediately recognized the vehicle as Dr. Foster's car, which she had seen hundreds of times during her security patrols. The uniformed figure approached the vehicle with obvious familiarity, suggesting this wasn't a random encounter or a response to a reported incident. "That's definitely a police officer," Thompson observed, noting the uniform details visible even at the maximum zoom level. But what's he doing in our parking lot when there's no emergency call or reported incident? The footage continued as the officer, later identified as Ethan Sanders through badge number enhancement, spent several minutes examining the exterior of Foster's vehicle before opening the driver's side door and entering the car. This behavior was highly unusual for law enforcement personnel responding to legitimate calls, and Thompson felt a growing sense of unease as he watched. "Run that sequence again," Thompson instructed, his tone shifting from routine review to focused investigation. "I want to see exactly what he's doing inside that vehicle." Martinez replayed the footage at slower speed, allowing them to observe Sanders' movements inside Foster's car in greater detail. The officer spent approximately 3 minutes in the vehicle, during which his hands were clearly visible, manipulating something in the interior. When he exited the car and closed the door, his body language suggested satisfaction with whatever task he had completed. Thompson felt his stomach clench as the implications of what they were witnessing began to crystallize. A police officer had entered a faculty member's vehicle without authorization during a time when the vehicle's owner was verifiably in his office. Less than an hour later, that same faculty member had been arrested for drug possession during a traffic stop conducted by the same officer. "Get me camera feeds from every angle," Thompson ordered. "I want to see this from at least 3 different perspectives, and I want timestamps verified against our central server logs." Martinez quickly accessed additional camera feeds that covered Faculty Lot C from different angles. Camera 7 provided a clear view of Sanders approaching the vehicle, Camera 12 captured his entry and exit from the car, and Camera 15 recorded his departure from the parking lot. The multiple perspectives eliminated any possibility that they were misinterpreting what had occurred. The timestamp verification confirmed that Sanders had been in Foster's car from 4:13 p.m. to 4:16 p.m., approximately 40 minutes before Foster's arrest at 4:57 p.m. The precision of the timing suggested careful planning rather than coincidental police work. Thompson immediately contacted his superior, Vice President for Campus Operations, Margaret Walsh, who arrived at the security office within 15 minutes of receiving his call. Walsh's background included 10 years as a federal investigator before joining the university administration, and she recognized the severity of what Thompson was showing her. "This is evidence of a serious crime," Walsh said, after reviewing the footage from multiple angles. "If that officer planted evidence in Dr. Foster's vehicle, we're looking at conspiracy, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. We need to preserve this evidence and notify the appropriate authorities immediately." The discovery of the surveillance footage transformed Foster's case from a routine drug arrest to a potential police misconduct investigation. Walsh contacted the university's legal counsel, while Thompson began the process of securing and copying the relevant video files to prevent any possibility of accidental deletion or tampering. Meanwhile, Dr. Foster was experiencing his first morning in county jail, an environment so removed from his normal academic routine that it felt like being transported to an alien world. The concrete walls, metal fixtures, and constant noise created an atmosphere of institutional dehumanization that seemed designed to break the spirits of anyone subjected to it. Foster had spent most of the night thinking about the impossibility of the cocaine appearing in his glove compartment. As a scientist, he understood that effects required causes, and the presence of illegal drugs in his vehicle demanded an explanation that went beyond random chance or police luck. Someone had put those drugs in his car deliberately, but proving that fact would require evidence that he didn't currently have access to. His wife Elena arrived for visiting hours at 8 o'clock, accompanied by their attorney Marcus Williams. The reunion was emotional and brief, conducted through reinforced glass, using phones that made private conversation impossible. Elena's appearance showed the strain of managing a crisis that threatened everything their family had worked to achieve. "The university has suspended you pending investigation," Elena reported, her voice carefully controlled, despite the devastating nature of the news. Dean Hawthorne called this morning to explain the policy requirements. "You'll keep your salary and benefits, but you can't teach or conduct research." Foster nodded, having expected this development, but still feeling the blow of losing the work that had defined his identity for 12 years. His graduate students would be reassigned, his research projects would be suspended, and his reputation would be permanently damaged regardless of the eventual outcome of his criminal case. Attorney Williams leaned forward to speak into the phone. "Dr. Foster, I've reviewed the police report, and there are several aspects of your arrest that don't follow typical patterns. The officer's justification for the search seems thin, and the timing of events raises questions that I intend to explore thoroughly." Williams had already begun investigating Officer Sanders' background and arrest history, looking for patterns that might suggest a tendency toward misconduct or evidence manipulation. Police officers who planted evidence rarely limited themselves to a single incident, and Williams suspected that Foster's case might be part of a larger pattern of corruption. "I want you to think carefully about anything unusual you may have noticed in the weeks before your arrest," Williams continued. "Any encounters with police? Any sense that you were being followed or watched? Anything that seemed out of the ordinary?" Foster considered the question, searching his memory for details that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but could be relevant to understanding how he had been targeted. He had noticed a police car in the university area more frequently than usual, but hadn't thought much about it, given the campus's location in a busy urban district. Back at the university, news of Foster's arrest was spreading through the academic community with the rapid intensity of wildfire. Students gathered in small groups discussing their shock and disbelief, while faculty members struggled to reconcile the criminal charges with their knowledge of Foster's character and professionalism. Dr. Margaret Walsh, Foster's closest research collaborator, had spent the morning fielding phone calls from colleagues at other universities who had heard about the arrest through professional networks. The molecular biology community was small enough that news traveled quickly, and Foster's reputation for ethical research and innovative thinking made the drug charges seem particularly implausible. "This doesn't make sense," Dr. Walsh explained to Dr. Stephen Kim, a collaborator from Johns Hopkins University, who had called seeking clarification. "Ryan is one of the most principled people I know. He won't even accept free meals from equipment vendors because he thinks it creates conflicts of interest." Dr. Kim had worked with Foster on several joint publications and shared Walsh's bewilderment about the charges. "I've known Ryan for 8 years, and I've never seen him consume anything stronger than coffee. The idea that he would be involved with cocaine trafficking is completely inconsistent with everything I know about his character." The scientific community's support for Foster was creating a narrative that conflicted sharply with the police version of events. Colleagues who had worked with him for years were publicly stating their disbelief in his guilt, creating pressure for a thorough investigation of the circumstances surrounding his arrest. Foster's students organized an informal support group that met in the molecular biology building's main conference room. Sarah Chen, his doctoral advisee, had taken the lead in coordinating efforts to maintain continuity in research projects that Foster had been supervising. The students faced the practical challenge of continuing their work while their advisor was suspended and potentially facing years in prison. "Dr. Foster has always taught us that science requires evidence and systematic investigation," Chen told the gathered students. "If these charges are false, then the evidence will eventually prove his innocence. Our job is to support him and continue the research that he values so much." The Student Support Network began documenting Foster's research contributions and gathering testimonials about his character from academic colleagues. While these efforts couldn't directly impact his criminal case, they were building a record of his professional reputation that would be crucial for his eventual return to academic life. Officer Sanders reported for his shift with unusual enthusiasm, energized by the successful execution of his plan and the positive feedback from his supervisors. The arrest report he had filed was generating exactly the kind of attention he had hoped for, and he anticipated that his performance evaluation would reflect his proactive approach to drug enforcement. Sanders' partner for the day shift was Officer Maria Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who had been assigned to mentor newer officers in proper police procedures. Rodriguez had reviewed Sanders' arrest report and was impressed by what appeared to be excellent police work, resulting in a significant drug bust. "Nice work on that university professor," Rodriguez commented as they began their patrol. "It takes good instincts to spot criminal behavior in someone who looks completely legitimate on the surface." Sanders accepted the praise while internally savoring the irony that his criminal behavior was being celebrated as professional excellence. He had successfully framed an innocent man while enhancing his reputation within the police department, achieving both personal satisfaction and career advancement through a single act of calculated malice. The patrol assignment for Sanders and Rodriguez included the University District, an area Sanders knew well from his weeks of surveillance leading up to Foster's arrest. As they drove past the campus, Sanders felt a sense of ownership over the territory where he had successfully executed his plan. Neither Sanders nor Rodriguez noticed the increased security activity around Faculty Lot C, where campus police were installing additional cameras and conducting interviews with maintenance staff who might have witnessed unusual activity on Tuesday afternoon. The investigation that would eventually expose Sanders' crime was already underway, though its existence remained unknown to the officer who believed he had committed the perfect frame-up. At the district attorney's office, Prosecutor Janet Harrison was reviewing Foster's case file and preparing for the arraignment scheduled for Thursday morning. The case appeared straightforward based on the police report, a routine traffic stop that uncovered a significant quantity of cocaine, leading to charges that could result in 5 to 10 years in prison if Foster was convicted. Harrison's initial assessment of the case was positive from a prosecutorial standpoint. The defendant had no prior criminal history, which might support a plea bargain, but the quantity of drugs involved suggested serious criminal intent rather than simple personal use. The officer's report was detailed and professional, providing clear justification for the search that led to the drug discovery. However, Harrison was also aware of Foster's reputation within the academic community and the unusual nature of drug charges against a respected university professor. She made a note to personally review the evidence before proceeding with formal charges, wanting to ensure that the case was as solid as it appeared on paper. The forensic analysis of the cocaine seized from Foster's vehicle was being conducted at the State Crime Laboratory, where technicians were testing the substance for purity and weight to confirm the charges filed by Sanders. The drugs would also be tested for fingerprints and DNA evidence, though Sanders had been careful to handle the evidence while wearing gloves. What Sanders didn't know was that the crime laboratory's procedures included microscopic analysis that could identify the source and age of drug samples. The cocaine he had planted in Foster's car had been stored in police evidence lockers for several months, and laboratory analysis would eventually reveal chemical signatures that were inconsistent with recent drug trafficking activity. Foster's first court appearance was scheduled for Thursday morning, where he would enter a plea and have bail determined. Williams was preparing arguments for reasonable bail based on Foster's community ties and lack of criminal history, though the serious nature of the charges meant that any bail amount would be substantial. Elena Foster was working with a bail bondsman to secure the financial arrangements necessary to free her husband from jail pending trial. The process required using their home as collateral and demonstrated the immediate financial impact of criminal charges, even for families with substantial resources and professional employment. The media coverage of Foster's arrest was expanding as reporters investigated the background of the case and the unusual nature of drug charges against a university professor. Jennifer Walsh of the Metro Herald was developing a comprehensive story that would examine both the criminal allegations and the academic community's response to Foster's arrest. Walsh's investigation had uncovered Foster's extensive publication record, his research funding history, and testimonials from colleagues who expressed disbelief at the charges. The reporter was also exploring Sanders' background and arrest statistics, looking for patterns that might provide context for understanding the circumstances of Foster's arrest. As Wednesday evening approached, the various threads of investigation and support were beginning to weave together in ways that neither Foster nor Sanders yet understood. The surveillance footage discovered by campus security represented evidence that could potentially exonerate Foster while exposing Sanders' criminal behavior. The university's legal team was preparing to share their surveillance evidence with law enforcement authorities, though they were proceeding carefully to ensure that their actions didn't compromise either Foster's defense or any subsequent investigation of police misconduct. Foster spent his second night in jail with growing confidence that the truth would eventually emerge, though he couldn't yet imagine how university surveillance technology would provide the evidence necessary to prove his innocence. His scientific training had taught him that systematic investigation could solve even the most complex problems, and he was beginning to apply that methodology to understanding how and why he had been framed. Sanders, meanwhile, was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his perfect crime was about to be exposed by the very surveillance technology he had failed to consider during his planning. The evidence that would transform him from successful perpetrator to exposed criminal was already being analyzed by investigators who were beginning to understand the true nature of Dr. Foster's arrest. Thursday morning arrived, with the weight of revelation hanging over Millbrook University like storm clouds gathering before lightning strikes. Chief Security Officer David Thompson had spent the night reviewing and re-reviewing the surveillance footage, ensuring that every detail was documented with the precision that would be required when this evidence inevitably reached federal investigators. The university's legal team had assembled at 6 a.m. for an emergency meeting that would determine how to proceed with evidence that could exonerate Dr. Foster while potentially exposing systematic police corruption. Legal counsel Sandra Martinez had consulted with external experts in civil rights law, confirming that the surveillance footage represented evidence of serious federal crimes that required immediate action. "We have an obligation to share this evidence with Dr. Foster's defense team," Martinez explained to the assembled administrators. "But we also need to notify the FBI about potential civil rights violations. This isn't just about one wrongful arrest. It's about a police officer who may have destroyed other innocent lives." Vice President Margaret Walsh, whose background as a federal investigator gave her unique insight into the implications of their discovery, was coordinating with contacts at the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The surveillance footage would need to be preserved with chain of custody protocols that would ensure its admissibility in both criminal and civil proceedings. Meanwhile, Dr. Foster was preparing for his arraignment with attorney Marcus Williams in the county courthouse's attorney consultation room. Williams had received an urgent call from the university's legal team requesting an immediate meeting before the court proceedings, though the nature of their request remained cryptic pending their face-to-face conversation. "The university's attorneys want to meet with us before your arraignment," Williams explained to Foster. "They indicated they have information relevant to your case, but they couldn't discuss details over the phone." Foster felt a spark of hope for the first time since his arrest. The university's involvement suggested that his colleagues hadn't abandoned him, and the urgency of their request implied that they had discovered something significant. His scientific mind was already analyzing possibilities, though he couldn't yet imagine the scope of evidence that was about to transform his case. Sandra Martinez and David Thompson arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes before Foster's scheduled arraignment, carrying sealed evidence containers and documentation that would establish the authenticity of their surveillance footage. The meeting with Foster's defense team would be the first step in a process that would ultimately expose the truth behind his arrest. Williams reviewed the surveillance footage on Thompson's laptop with growing amazement and anger. The video clearly showed Officer Sanders entering Foster's vehicle and spending several minutes manipulating something inside before exiting with obvious satisfaction. The timestamps confirmed that this had occurred less than an hour before Foster's arrest. "This is evidence of a felony," Williams stated, his voice tight with controlled fury. "That officer planted evidence in your car, Dr. Foster. This footage proves your innocence and exposes criminal behavior by the arresting officer." Foster watched the surveillance video with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an experiment. Seeing Sanders deliberately plant the cocaine that would destroy his life created a strange sense of validation. His instincts about the impossibility of the drugs appearing in his car had been correct. Someone had indeed framed him, and now there was proof. Martinez explained the university's position and their intention to cooperate fully with Foster's defense, while also notifying federal authorities about the civil rights violations they had uncovered. "We're prepared to testify about the authenticity of this footage and provide any additional evidence that might be relevant to your case." The arraignment proceeded with Williams entering a plea of not guilty on Foster's behalf, though neither the prosecutor nor Judge Patricia Coleman was yet aware of the evidence that would soon transform the case. Foster's bail was set at $50,000, an amount that Elena Foster had already arranged through their bail bondsman. Foster walked out of the courthouse a free man for the first time in 48 hours, though his legal battle was just beginning. The surveillance footage provided powerful evidence of his innocence, but proving Sanders' guilt would require additional investigation and careful legal strategy. Williams immediately contacted the FBI's local office to report the evidence of civil rights violations, triggering a federal investigation that would examine not only Sanders' actions, but also potential patterns of misconduct within the police department. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez was assigned to lead the investigation, bringing 15 years of experience in civil rights cases to bear on Foster's situation. Agent Martinez reviewed the university's surveillance footage within hours of receiving Williams' report, recognizing immediately that the evidence represented a clear case of evidence planting and potential conspiracy to violate Foster's civil rights. The federal investigation would proceed parallel to Foster's criminal defense, creating multiple avenues for exposing the truth. Officer Sanders reported for his Thursday shift, unaware that his crime had been discovered and documented by multiple investigative agencies. He continued to receive praise from supervisors and colleagues for his arrest of Dr. Foster, reinforcing his belief that his plan had succeeded perfectly. Sanders' partner for the day was Officer Jennifer Hayes, a rookie who was eager to learn from what she believed was Sanders' excellent police work. Hayes had read the arrest report and was impressed by Sanders' ability to identify criminal behavior in an unlikely suspect. "How did you know to search the professor's car?" Hayes asked as they began their patrol. "Most people would assume someone like that was completely legitimate." Sanders enjoyed the opportunity to explain his supposed investigative skills, creating a fictional narrative about behavioral indicators and suspicious activity that had justified his actions. The irony that he was being praised for criminal behavior while training a new officer wasn't lost on him, though he viewed it as confirmation of his superior intelligence and planning ability. The federal investigation was moving rapidly as Agent Martinez assembled a team to examine Sanders' arrest history and identify potential patterns of misconduct. FBI analysts were reviewing Sanders' previous cases, looking for similarities in evidence discovery, arrest circumstances, and demographic patterns that might indicate systematic targeting of minority suspects. Dr. Foster returned to his home for the first time since Tuesday afternoon, finding dozens of messages from colleagues, students, and friends who had learned of his arrest through news coverage and academic networks. The outpouring of support was emotionally overwhelming, providing evidence that his reputation within the scientific community remained intact despite the criminal charges. Elena Foster had taken leave from her surgical practice to focus on managing the crisis that threatened their family's stability. The financial costs of legal defense, bail, and lost income were mounting rapidly, while the emotional toll of public scrutiny and media attention added additional stress to an already impossible situation. Foster's graduate student Sarah Chen had organized a letter-writing campaign among academic colleagues, gathering testimonials about Foster's character and professional integrity that could be useful for his defense. The response had been immediate and overwhelming, with scientists from around the world expressing disbelief at the charges and offering support for their colleague. The molecular biology department had essentially shut down normal operations as faculty and students focused on supporting Foster and maintaining continuity in research projects that he had been supervising. Department Chair Dr. Robert Kim was coordinating with university administration to ensure that Foster's eventual return to teaching would be as smooth as possible. Meanwhile, the State Crime Laboratory had completed its analysis of the cocaine seized from Foster's vehicle, generating results that would provide additional evidence of Sanders' crime. The laboratory technicians had discovered chemical signatures indicating that the drugs had been stored in controlled conditions for several months, inconsistent with active drug trafficking. The forensic analysis also revealed the absence of any fingerprints or DNA evidence linking Foster to the cocaine, despite the fact that drug traffickers typically handle their product directly. The evidence suggested that the drugs had been planted by someone wearing gloves, exactly as the surveillance footage had documented. Prosecutor Janet Harrison received the laboratory results and the FBI's notification about their civil rights investigation on Thursday afternoon, fundamentally altering her assessment of Foster's case. The federal investigation suggested serious problems with the arrest that could undermine the entire prosecution. Harrison immediately contacted her supervisor, District Attorney Michael Thompson, to discuss the implications of the federal investigation and the questions it raised about the validity of Sanders' arrest. The district attorney's office faced the uncomfortable possibility that they were prosecuting an innocent man based on fabricated evidence. "We need to suspend prosecution pending the outcome of the federal investigation," Thompson decided after reviewing the available information. "If there's evidence that the arresting officer planted drugs, we can't proceed with charges based on those same drugs." The decision to suspend prosecution was communicated to Foster's attorney Williams, providing additional confirmation that the truth was beginning to emerge through multiple investigative channels. Foster's case was transitioning from criminal defense to potential civil rights litigation as evidence of Sanders' misconduct accumulated. Sanders finished his Thursday shift with continued satisfaction about his successful frame-up of Foster, unaware that federal agents were already analyzing his arrest patterns and preparing to confront him with evidence of his crimes. His confidence in his superior planning and execution would soon be shattered by the reality of systematic investigation. The FBI's preliminary review of Sanders' arrest history had identified troubling patterns that suggested Foster was not his first victim. Sanders had conducted an unusually high number of vehicle searches that resulted in drug discoveries, particularly involving minority suspects who maintained their innocence throughout the legal process. Agent Martinez was coordinating with the district attorney's office to review all of Sanders' previous drug arrests, looking for cases where innocent people might have been convicted based on planted evidence. The investigation was expanding beyond Foster's case to examine potential systematic violations of civil rights that could affect dozens of victims. Foster spent Thursday evening with his family, processing the emotional whiplash of transitioning from county jail to the possibility of complete exoneration within 48 hours. The surveillance footage had provided definitive proof of his innocence, but the broader implications of Sanders' actions were still unfolding. The university's decision to preserve and share the surveillance evidence had been crucial to exposing the truth, demonstrating the importance of institutional support for faculty members facing false accusations. Foster's colleagues had rallied around him, not just emotionally, but with concrete actions that had preserved evidence of his innocence. Elena Foster was beginning to process the reality that her husband had been the victim of a calculated attack by a police officer who had targeted him specifically because of his race and success. The personal nature of the attack made Sanders' actions feel even more violating than random police misconduct. Williams was preparing a comprehensive strategy that would include not only defending Foster against the criminal charges, but also pursuing civil rights litigation against Sanders and potentially the police department that had failed to supervise him properly. The case was evolving from criminal defense to civil rights advocacy, with national implications. The media coverage of Foster's case was intensifying as reporters began investigating the federal civil rights angle and the university's surveillance evidence. Jennifer Walsh of the Metro Herald was developing an exclusive story about the surveillance footage that would expose Sanders' crime to public scrutiny. Walsh's investigation had also uncovered information about Sanders' background and arrest statistics that raised additional questions about his methods and motivations. The reporter was building a comprehensive narrative that would examine both Foster's specific case and the broader issues of police accountability and racial targeting. Foster's return to campus was emotional, as colleagues and students expressed relief at his release and anger at the injustice he had suffered. The molecular biology building had become an informal headquarters for organizing support and coordinating with his legal team to ensure that all relevant evidence was preserved and documented. The academic community's response to Foster's case was generating broader discussions about racial bias in law enforcement and the vulnerability of successful minorities to false accusations designed to destroy their achievements. Foster's experience was resonating with academics who recognized the fragility of professional success when confronted with systematic prejudice. As Thursday evening concluded, multiple investigations were converging on evidence that would ultimately expose Sanders' crime and vindicate Foster completely. The surveillance footage that had captured Sanders planting evidence would become the centerpiece of both criminal charges against the officer and civil rights litigation that could result in significant financial compensation for Foster. Sanders remained unaware that his perfect crime had been documented from multiple angles by surveillance technology he had failed to consider during his planning. The confidence that had sustained him through 2 days of praise and recognition was about to be shattered by evidence that would transform him from celebrated officer to criminal defendant. The federal investigation was expanding to examine whether Sanders had received any assistance or encouragement from other officers, looking for evidence of conspiracy or systematic cover-up that might indicate broader corruption within the police department. The implications of Foster's case were growing beyond individual misconduct to questions about institutional accountability and reform. Foster's vindication was approaching through multiple channels: criminal charges being dropped, federal civil rights investigation, media exposure, and academic community support. The systematic approach to proving his innocence reflected the same methodical thinking that had made him successful as a scientist, demonstrating that truth and evidence could ultimately triumph over malicious fabrication. The evidence was emerging with the clarity and precision that Foster had always associated with good science, providing definitive proof that would expose Sanders' crime while restoring Foster's reputation and career. The truth that had seemed impossible to prove from inside a jail cell was about to be revealed through the very technology and institutional support that Sanders had failed to anticipate. Friday morning arrived with the inevitability of a reckoning that had been building since Officer Ethan Sanders first decided to destroy Dr. Ryan Foster's life. At exactly 8 a.m., FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez walked into the police department's main building, carrying a sealed briefcase containing evidence that would shatter Sanders' world as completely as he had attempted to destroy Foster's. Agent Martinez was accompanied by Detective Michael Torres from the Internal Affairs Division, creating an intimidating presence that immediately caught the attention of officers beginning their morning shifts. Word spread quickly through the department that federal agents were conducting interviews related to civil rights violations, though Sanders remained unaware that he was the target of their investigation. Sanders was in the department's roll call room, receiving his daily assignment, when Sergeant Patricia Coleman approached with a carefully neutral expression. "Sanders, you need to report to Internal Affairs immediately. They have some questions about one of your recent arrests." The request seemed routine to Sanders, who had been through standard post-arrest interviews before, as part of the department's quality assurance procedures. He assumed that his arrest of Dr. Foster was being reviewed as an example of excellent police work, possibly for training purposes or commendation consideration. Sanders walked confidently to the Internal Affairs office, where Detective Torres and Agent Martinez were waiting with the surveillance footage that would expose his crime. The interview room was equipped with recording equipment that would capture every word of Sanders' responses to questions about his actions in Faculty Lot C. "Officer Sanders, please have a seat," Agent Martinez began, her tone professional, but carrying an undertone of authority that immediately made Sanders more alert to potential problems. "We need to discuss your arrest of Dr. Ryan Foster on Tuesday afternoon." Sanders settled into his chair with practiced confidence, prepared to explain his professional conduct during what he believed had been exemplary police work. Dr. Foster's arrest was conducted according to standard procedures. I observed suspicious behavior, conducted a lawful traffic stop, and discovered illegal narcotics during a properly authorized search. Detective Torres opened a laptop computer and positioned it so that Sanders could see the screen clearly. "Officer Sanders, before we discuss your version of events, we'd like you to review some footage that was provided by Millbrook University's security department." The surveillance video began playing, showing a wide shot of Faculty Lot C during the quiet afternoon hours before Foster's arrest. Sanders watched with growing confusion as he saw his own figure approaching Foster's Honda Civic with deliberate purpose, clearly identifiable despite the camera's distance. Sanders' first reaction was surprise rather than panic, as he hadn't considered the possibility that his actions in the parking lot had been recorded. His mind was racing through potential explanations for his presence near Foster's vehicle, searching for a narrative that would explain his behavior without admitting to evidence planting. "I was conducting routine security checks in the area," Sanders said carefully, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. "The university requested increased police presence due to recent vehicle break-ins." Agent Martinez paused the video at the moment when Sanders opened Foster's car door and entered the vehicle. "Officer Sanders, can you explain why your routine security check required entering Dr. Foster's car without his knowledge or consent?" The question hung in the air like a trap that was slowly closing around Sanders' carefully constructed lies. He could see himself clearly in the video, spending several minutes inside Foster's vehicle while Foster was verifiably in his office. There was no legitimate law enforcement reason for his actions. "I observed what appeared to be suspicious items visible through the window," Sanders replied, though his explanation sounded weak even to himself. "I was investigating potential evidence of criminal activity." Detective Torres enhanced the video zoom to show Sanders' hands moving deliberately inside the vehicle, clearly manipulating something in the glove compartment area. "Officer Sanders, this footage shows you placing something in the vehicle, not removing evidence that was already there." Sanders felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead as he realized that the surveillance footage was capturing his evidence, planting with high-definition clarity. His perfect crime was being exposed frame by frame, leaving him with no plausible explanation for his actions. "I may have been repositioning items to get a better view," Sanders said desperately, though he knew his explanations were becoming increasingly implausible. "Police work sometimes requires moving things to conduct thorough searches." Agent Martinez stopped the video and leaned forward with the intensity of a federal investigator who had caught a suspect in obvious lies. "Officer Sanders, we've also reviewed your arrest history and identified patterns that suggest Dr. Foster is not your first victim. How many other innocent people have you framed with planted evidence?" The question hit Sanders like a physical blow, confirming that the investigation had expanded beyond Foster's case to examine his entire career. The federal agents weren't just investigating a single incident, they were building a comprehensive case against his systematic misconduct. Sanders' lawyer instincts finally kicked in, though his training was insufficient for the situation he now faced. "I want to speak with my union representative before answering any more questions." "That's your right," Agent Martinez acknowledged, though her tone suggested that Sanders' request for representation was confirmation of his guilt rather than protection of his innocence. "But I want you to understand the seriousness of your situation. We have evidence of civil rights violations, filing false reports, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to deny constitutional protections." The list of potential charges was devastating, representing not just the end of Sanders' career, but the possibility of decades in federal prison. Civil rights violations carried serious penalties, and the systematic nature of his actions could result in enhanced sentences that would effectively end his life as a free man. Detective Torres concluded the interview with a warning that Sanders was under investigation for serious crimes and should not attempt to contact any potential witnesses or co-conspirators. Sanders left the Internal Affairs Office knowing that his career was over and his freedom was in jeopardy. Word of Sanders' interrogation spread through the police department within hours, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty as officers wondered whether their own arrests would be scrutinized for signs of misconduct. The federal investigation was casting doubt on the integrity of the entire department. Meanwhile, Dr. Foster was experiencing his first full day of freedom since his arrest. Though his vindication was still incomplete pending the formal dropping of charges, Foster had returned to his home office and was beginning the process of rebuilding his life while processing the emotional trauma of being targeted for destruction by a police officer. Foster's attorney, Marcus Williams, called with updates on the federal investigation and the prosecutor's decision to suspend all charges pending the outcome of the civil rights case. "Dr. Foster, the evidence against Officer Sanders is overwhelming. He's going to be arrested, and you're going to be completely exonerated." The confirmation of his impending vindication brought Foster mixed emotions, relief at proving his innocence, combined with anger at the malicious attack he had suffered. Sanders had deliberately chosen to destroy Foster's life for no reason other than racial resentment and career advancement. Elena Foster was coordinating with the university's administration to plan for her husband's return to teaching and research. Dean Patricia Hawthorne had called personally to apologize for the suspension and express the university's commitment to supporting Foster's transition back to academic life. The university stands behind you completely, Hawthorne assured Foster during their phone conversation. We're prepared to make any accommodations necessary to help you resume your research and teaching responsibilities. Foster's colleagues in the molecular biology department were planning a welcome celebration for his return, though they were also struggling to process the reality that one of their friends had been targeted for destruction by someone sworn to protect and serve the community. Dr. Margaret Walsh, Foster's research collaborator, was working with university media relations to prepare statements about Foster's innocence and the department's support for his return. The academic community's response to Sanders's exposure would send a strong message about institutional solidarity against racial targeting. The FBI's investigation was expanding as Agent Martinez identified additional cases where Sanders' arrests followed suspicious patterns. Several of Sanders' previous defendants had maintained their innocence throughout legal proceedings, claiming that evidence had been planted during searches that seemed unnecessarily aggressive. Agent Martinez was coordinating with public defenders who had represented Sanders' previous defendants, looking for cases where innocent people might have been convicted based on fabricated evidence. The investigation was revealing a pattern of misconduct that had potentially destroyed multiple lives over several years. Sanders spent Friday afternoon consulting with his union representative and a criminal defense attorney, trying to develop a strategy for defending against charges that appeared impossible to dispute. The surveillance footage provided clear evidence of his evidence planting, making denial a futile strategy. Sanders' attorney, David Mitchell, reviewed the evidence against his client with growing despair. Ethan, the video footage is devastating. They have you on camera, planting evidence in Foster's car. There's no way to explain this as legitimate police work. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating Sanders's consciousness as he realized that his careful planning had been undone by surveillance technology he had failed to consider. His career was over, his freedom was threatened, and his reputation would be permanently destroyed. Sanders' wife Jennifer learned of his situation through a phone call from his union representative, creating a family crisis that paralleled the professional and legal disasters that were unfolding. The Sanders family faced financial ruin, social ostracism, and the possibility that their husband and father would spend decades in federal prison. The police department's administration was preparing for the public relations disaster that would follow Sanders's arrest and the exposure of systematic civil rights violations within their ranks. Chief of Police Robert Martinez was coordinating with city officials to develop responses to questions about supervision and accountability. Media coverage of the case was intensifying as reporters learned about the federal investigation and Sanders' imminent arrest. Jennifer Walsh of the Metro Herald was preparing an exclusive story about the surveillance footage that would expose Sanders' crime to public scrutiny while documenting Foster's vindication. Foster's vindication was becoming a national story as civil rights organizations and academic associations expressed outrage at Sanders' actions and support for Foster's courage in fighting false charges. The case was highlighting broader issues of racial targeting and police accountability that resonated far beyond the immediate participants. The university's decision to preserve and share surveillance evidence was being praised as an example of institutional responsibility and support for faculty members facing false accusations. Foster's case was demonstrating the importance of systematic documentation and institutional backing in exposing police misconduct. As Friday evening approached, Sanders was preparing for his arrest, while Foster was planning his return to the academic life that Sanders had tried to destroy. The confrontation between truth and fabrication was reaching its inevitable conclusion as evidence overcame conspiracy and justice prepared to replace injustice. Sanders' perfect crime had been exposed by the very technology and institutional support that he had failed to consider during his planning. His confidence in his superior intelligence and careful execution had been shattered by systematic investigation and documentation that revealed his actions with undeniable clarity. The federal investigation was preparing to announce Sanders' arrest while simultaneously clearing Foster of all charges, creating a dramatic reversal that would vindicate the innocent while exposing the guilty. The truth that Foster had insisted on from his jail cell was about to be confirmed through multiple forms of evidence that Sanders had never imagined existed. Foster's experience as a victim of deliberate police misconduct was transforming him from passive target to active advocate for justice reform, setting the stage for broader changes that would extend far beyond his individual case. His vindication would represent not just personal justice, but systematic accountability that could prevent future victims from suffering similar attacks. The confrontation between Sanders' lies and documentary evidence was concluding with the inevitable triumph of truth over fabrication, demonstrating that systematic investigation and institutional support could expose even carefully planned crimes. Sanders' attempt to destroy Foster had ultimately exposed his own criminal behavior, while strengthening Foster's position as a voice for justice and accountability. Monday morning brought the kind of media circus that transforms local news into national headlines, as reporters from across the country descended on Millbrook University to cover the arrest of Officer Ethan Sanders and the complete vindication of Dr. Ryan Foster. The story had every element that captured public attention: police corruption, racial injustice, academic integrity, and surveillance technology exposing the truth. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez stood before a packed press conference at the federal building, flanked by U.S. Attorney Patricia Coleman and Civil Rights Division Chief Michael Torres. The formal announcement of Sanders' arrest on federal civil rights charges marked the official beginning of his legal reckoning and Foster's public vindication. Officer Ethan Sanders has been arrested on charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights, filing false police reports, evidence tampering, and deprivation of rights under color of law, Agent Martinez announced to the assembled media. The evidence shows a deliberate pattern of targeting innocent citizens, particularly members of minority communities, with fabricated criminal charges. The federal charges carried potential sentences totaling 40 years in prison, effectively ensuring that Sanders would spend the remainder of his productive life behind bars if convicted. The severity of the charges reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and the federal government's commitment to prosecuting civil rights violations. Sanders had been arrested at his home at 6 a.m. by federal agents, a dramatic perp walk that was captured by news cameras and broadcast nationally within hours. The image of a police officer in handcuffs being led away by FBI agents provided powerful visual evidence of accountability that resonated with communities that had experienced similar police misconduct. Dr. Foster watched the press conference from his home office, experiencing a complex mixture of vindication, relief, and lingering anger at the ordeal he had endured. The federal charges against Sanders represented justice, but they couldn't undo the trauma of being jailed for crimes he didn't commit or restore the time lost from his research and teaching. The press conference also announced that the FBI had identified at least 12 other cases where Sanders appeared to have planted evidence or filed false reports, affecting predominantly minority defendants who had maintained their innocence throughout their legal proceedings. The investigation was expanding to review every arrest Sanders had made during his 8-year career. District Attorney Michael Thompson held a separate press conference to announce that all charges against Dr. Foster were being dropped immediately, with the prosecutor's office issuing a formal apology for the injustice he had suffered. Thompson also announced the creation of a special review unit to examine all convictions based on Sanders' arrests. Dr. Foster is completely innocent of all charges, Thompson stated emphatically. He was the victim of a calculated attack by a corrupt police officer who violated his oath and betrayed the public trust. We are committed to ensuring that justice is served and that similar misconduct is prevented in the future. The university held its own press conference, where President Dr. Elizabeth Warren announced Foster's immediate reinstatement to full faculty status with back pay and benefits. The university also announced the establishment of a new research center focused on criminal justice reform, with Foster being invited to serve as its founding director. Dr. Foster has demonstrated extraordinary grace and dignity throughout this ordeal, President Warren announced. His commitment to truth and evidence-based thinking exemplifies the best values of academic inquiry. We are honored to have him as a member of our faculty and look forward to his continued contributions to both science and justice. Foster's colleagues in the molecular biology department organized a welcome back celebration that drew hundreds of faculty, students, and community members who wanted to demonstrate their support for someone who had become a symbol of resilience against systematic injustice. The event was both a personal celebration and a statement about institutional solidarity. Dr. Margaret Walsh, Foster's research collaborator, spoke emotionally about the impact of Sanders's attack on the entire academic community. "What happened to Dr. Foster could happen to any of us," she said. "His vindication represents not just personal justice, but a victory for everyone who believes that truth and evidence should triumph over prejudice and fabrication." Foster's return to teaching was met with standing ovations from students who had followed his case and viewed him as both an academic mentor and a civil rights hero. His first lecture since the arrest drew overflow crowds of students, faculty, and community members who wanted to witness his return to the classroom. The surveillance footage that had exposed Sanders's crime was being analyzed by security experts who praised the university's comprehensive monitoring system and rapid response to suspected misconduct. The case was being cited as an example of how institutional technology and policies could protect innocent people from police corruption. Sanders, meanwhile, was being held in federal custody pending trial, experiencing the same criminal justice system that he had manipulated to destroy innocent lives. His bail had been set at $500,000, an amount that his family could not afford given the financial devastation caused by his legal troubles. Sanders' attorney, David Mitchell, was struggling to develop a defense strategy against evidence that seemed impossible to dispute. The surveillance footage provided clear documentation of Sanders planting evidence, while forensic analysis confirmed that the cocaine had been stored in police custody for months before appearing in Foster's car. The police department's Internal Affairs Division was conducting its own investigation into Sanders's misconduct and the supervision failures that had allowed his crimes to continue undetected. Several supervisors were facing disciplinary action for failing to identify suspicious patterns in Sanders's arrest statistics. Chief of Police Robert Martinez held a somber press conference to address the department's response to Sanders' crimes and outline reforms designed to prevent similar misconduct. The reforms included enhanced supervision of drug arrests, mandatory body cameras for all searches, and expanded training on civil rights and ethical policing. Officer Sanders' actions represent a betrayal of everything we stand for as law enforcement professionals, Chief Martinez stated. "We are implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure that such misconduct never occurs again in our department." The civil rights organizations that had initially been skeptical of Foster's case were now praising his courage in fighting false charges and demanding systematic reforms to address police misconduct. Foster's vindication was being cited as evidence that persistence and institutional support could overcome even carefully planned police corruption. Foster's attorney, Marcus Williams, was preparing comprehensive civil rights litigation against Sanders, personally and the police department institutionally, seeking damages for the violation of Foster's constitutional rights and the department's failure to supervise Sanders properly. The lawsuit could result in millions of dollars in compensation for the injustice Foster had suffered. The financial implications of Sanders' crimes extended beyond personal litigation to broader costs for the city and police department. Every conviction based on Sanders' arrests would need to be reviewed, potentially resulting in dozens of wrongful conviction settlements that could cost taxpayers millions of dollars. Foster's case was attracting attention from national civil rights organizations and academic associations who viewed his experience as representative of broader patterns of racial targeting and police misconduct. Foster was being invited to speak at conferences and universities about his experience and the need for justice reform. The media coverage of Foster's vindication was generating discussions about racial bias in law enforcement and the vulnerability of successful minorities to attacks designed to destroy their achievements. Foster's case was resonating with communities that had experienced similar targeting by corrupt police officers. Sanders' previous victims were beginning to come forward as news of his arrest spread, creating a growing list of people whose lives had been damaged by his planted evidence and false reports. Many had been convicted based on Sanders' fabricated evidence and spent years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. The State Crime Laboratory was conducting comprehensive reviews of all evidence processed from Sanders' arrests, looking for signs of tampering or contamination that might have affected other cases. The laboratory's findings would be crucial for overturning wrongful convictions and identifying the full scope of Sanders's misconduct. Foster was using his newfound platform to advocate for criminal justice reforms that would prevent other innocent people from suffering similar attacks. His scientific background gave him unique credibility in discussing evidence-based approaches to police accountability and misconduct prevention. The university's decision to preserve and share surveillance evidence was being studied by other institutions as a model for protecting faculty and students from false accusations. Foster's case demonstrated the importance of comprehensive documentation and institutional support in exposing misconduct. Foster's Research Center for Criminal Justice Reform was attracting funding from foundations and government agencies interested in supporting evidence-based approaches to police accountability. The center would study patterns of misconduct and develop technological solutions for detecting and preventing police corruption. Sanders' trial was scheduled for 6 months later, though his attorney was already discussing plea negotiations given the overwhelming evidence against him. Sanders faced the possibility of decades in federal prison, effectively ending his life as a free man while providing some measure of justice for his victims. The psychological impact of Sanders' crimes on his family was becoming apparent as his wife and children struggled with the reality that their husband and father had deliberately destroyed innocent lives. The Sanders family faced financial ruin and social ostracism that would follow them for years. Foster's vindication was complete from legal and professional standpoints, but the emotional healing would take longer as he processed the trauma of being targeted for destruction by someone sworn to protect and serve. Foster was working with counselors who specialized in helping victims of police misconduct. The broader implications of Foster's case were extending beyond individual justice to systematic reforms that could prevent similar misconduct. Police departments across the country were examining their own supervision and accountability systems in response to the national attention generated by Sanders' crimes. Foster's students were organizing academic conferences focused on the intersection of science and justice, using their mentors' experience as a catalyst for broader discussions about evidence-based approaches to fairness and accountability. Foster's vindication was inspiring a new generation of academics committed to justice reform. The surveillance technology that had exposed Sanders' crime was being upgraded and expanded as the university invested in comprehensive monitoring systems that could protect community members from false accusations and criminal targeting. Foster's case had demonstrated the crucial importance of technological documentation in exposing police misconduct. Sanders' crimes had shattered public trust in the police department, requiring years of reform and community engagement to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by his systematic misconduct. The department's credibility would depend on demonstrating genuine commitment to preventing similar corruption. Foster's transition from victim to advocate was attracting national attention as he used his experience to promote evidence-based approaches to criminal justice reform. His scientific background and personal experience with police misconduct gave him unique authority in discussions about accountability and prevention. The reckoning that Sanders faced represented not just individual accountability, but systematic recognition that police misconduct would be exposed and prosecuted regardless of the perpetrator's position or authority. Foster's vindication demonstrated that truth and evidence could ultimately triumph over conspiracy and corruption. As the immediate crisis of Sanders' arrest and Foster's vindication began to settle into longer-term processes of legal accountability and institutional reform, both men faced futures that had been fundamentally transformed by their confrontation. Sanders would spend decades in prison, while Foster would spend years advocating for the justice reforms that his experience had made necessary. The case was becoming a landmark example of how surveillance technology, institutional support, and systematic investigation could expose even carefully planned police misconduct while protecting innocent victims from corrupt officers who had betrayed their oaths and violated the public trust. 6 months after the surveillance footage first exposed Officer Ethan Sanders' crime, the federal courthouse in downtown was packed with spectators, media representatives, and civil rights advocates who had traveled from across the country to witness the conclusion of a case that had become a symbol of both police corruption and the power of truth to overcome systematic injustice. Dr. Ryan Foster sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery, watching as Sanders was led to the defendant's table in orange federal prison clothing and restraints. The transformation was startling. The confident police officer who had destroyed Foster's life with calculated malice had been replaced by a broken man facing the consequences of crimes that had shattered multiple families and communities. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with anticipation as victims, their families, civil rights lawyers, and journalists filled every available seat. Foster's wife Elena sat beside him, her hand resting supportively on his arm, as they prepared to witness the final chapter of an ordeal that had tested their family's resilience and ultimately transformed their understanding of justice and accountability. Judge Patricia Coleman called the court to session for Sanders' sentencing hearing, the culmination of legal proceedings that had revealed the full scope of his criminal behavior. Sanders had ultimately pleaded guilty to all federal charges in exchange for a sentence recommendation that would still keep him in prison for 25 years, effectively ending his life as a free man. The plea negotiations had been brief and decisive, as Sanders' attorney had recognized that the surveillance evidence made conviction inevitable on all counts. The decision to plead guilty was motivated more by Sanders' desire to avoid a lengthy trial that would have exposed even more details of his criminal behavior than by any genuine remorse for his actions. U.S. Attorney Patricia Martinez addressed the court with a detailed recitation of Sanders' crimes, describing a pattern of misconduct that had affected at least 18 victims over 8 years. Your Honor, the defendant systematically targeted innocent citizens based on racial bias and career ambition, planting evidence and filing false reports that destroyed lives and corrupted the justice system he was sworn to protect. The prosecutor's presentation included a comprehensive timeline of Sanders' criminal activities, beginning with his first documented evidence planting incident in 2016 and continuing through his attack on Foster in 2024. The pattern revealed escalating audacity and sophistication as Sanders became more confident in his ability to frame innocent people without detection. Martinez presented detailed evidence of Sanders' victim selection criteria, demonstrating that he had specifically targeted successful minority professionals who had achieved respect and standing in their communities. The targeting appeared to be motivated by a combination of racial resentment and career ambition, as Sanders used fabricated arrests to enhance his performance statistics. The prosecutor's presentation included testimony from Sanders' victims, many of whom had served prison sentences for crimes they didn't commit before the investigation of Foster's case led to the discovery of Sanders' evidence planting. Each victim's story added another layer of devastation to the scope of Sanders' criminal enterprise. James Mitchell, a construction worker who had spent 3 years in prison based on Sanders' planted cocaine, addressed the court with quiet dignity despite the years of his life that had been stolen by false accusations. Officer Sanders didn't just plant drugs in my car, Mitchell testified, his voice steady but filled with pain. He planted doubt in my children's minds about their father's character. He planted fear in my community about trusting police. He planted hatred in my heart that I'm still working to overcome. Mitchell's testimony was particularly powerful because his case had been among the first that Sanders had fabricated, establishing a pattern that would continue for years without detection. Mitchell had lost his job, his apartment, and custody of his children as a result of his wrongful conviction, and was still rebuilding his life despite his eventual exoneration. Carmen Rodriguez, a nurse who had been framed by Sanders during a traffic stop near the hospital where she worked, described the professional and personal devastation that had resulted from her false arrest. I dedicated my career to healing people, she testified, but Officer Sanders' lies destroyed my ability to practice nursing and forced me to question everything I believed about justice and fairness. Rodriguez had been stripped of her nursing license following her conviction and had spent 2 years working minimum wage jobs while fighting to prove her innocence. Even after her exoneration, the licensing board had required extensive documentation and testimony before reinstating her professional credentials. Michael Johnson, a high school teacher who had been targeted by Sanders during his lunch break, spoke about the impact on his students and the educational community. Officer Sanders didn't just attack me, Johnson explained. He attacked every student who looked up to me as a role model and every parent who trusted me with their children's education. Johnson's conviction had resulted in his immediate termination from the school district and permanent disqualification from teaching in the state. Even after his exoneration, the school board had been reluctant to rehire him, citing concerns about community perception and potential liability issues. Foster was called to address the court as Sanders' most prominent victim, the case that had ultimately exposed the pattern of corruption that had operated undetected for years. Foster's statement was measured and scientific in its precision, focusing on evidence and systematic analysis rather than emotional appeals for revenge. Your Honor, Officer Sanders committed crimes against not just individual victims, but against the very concept of justice itself, Foster began, his voice steady and clear despite the emotional weight of the moment. He perverted scientific evidence, corrupted legal proceedings, and betrayed the public trust in ways that damaged our entire community's faith in fairness and accountability. Foster continued with the analytical approach that had characterized his response throughout the ordeal. As a scientist, I understand that effects require causes, and Officer Sanders' crimes were not random events, but systematic attacks on constitutional principles. His sentence should reflect both the individual harm he caused and the institutional damage that will require years to repair. Foster's statement included a detailed analysis of the scientific principles that Sanders had violated through his evidence planting, explaining how the fabrication of evidence corrupted the entire process of criminal investigation and prosecution. His academic perspective provided unique insights into the systematic nature of Sanders' crimes. Officer Sanders understood that planted evidence would be analyzed by forensic laboratories and presented to juries as objective scientific proof, Foster explained. His manipulation of this process represents not just criminal behavior, but a betrayal of scientific principles that form the foundation of our justice system. Foster also addressed the broader implications of Sanders' crimes for community trust and police legitimacy. Every false arrest, every planted piece of evidence, every fabricated report undermined the credibility of honest police officers and created doubt about the reliability of criminal investigations throughout our community. The defense attorney's plea for leniency fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence of Sanders' crimes and the devastating impact on his victims. Attorney David Mitchell acknowledged that his client's behavior was inexcusable, but argued that Sanders' personal background and family circumstances should be considered in determining his sentence. Mitchell presented evidence of Sanders' difficult childhood and the financial pressures that his family was facing, suggesting that these factors had contributed to his criminal behavior without excusing it. The presentation was brief and seemed to recognize that the scope of Sanders' crimes made a lenient sentence impossible to justify. Sanders himself offered a brief apology that seemed hollow and inadequate, given the scope of destruction he had caused through his deliberate targeting of innocent people. His statement was carefully scripted by his attorney and focused on accepting responsibility without providing details that could be used against him in civil litigation. I apologize to my victims and their families for the harm I have caused, Sanders read from a prepared statement. I accept full responsibility for my actions and the consequences that follow. The apology lasted less than 2 minutes and included no explanation of his motivations or acknowledgement of the systematic nature of his crimes. Judge Coleman's sentencing remarks were delivered with the gravity appropriate to crimes that had shaken public confidence in law enforcement and violated the most fundamental principles of constitutional protection. Officer Sanders, you have betrayed not only your victims, but every honest police officer who risks their safety to protect our communities. The judge's comments included a detailed analysis of the aggravating factors that justified a harsh sentence, including the number of victims, the systematic nature of the crimes, the abuse of official authority, and the lasting damage to community trust in law enforcement. Your crimes strike at the heart of our constitutional system, Judge Coleman continued. You used the authority granted to you by the people to destroy the lives of innocent citizens based on racial bias and personal ambition. The sentence I impose must reflect the seriousness of these offenses and serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar crimes. The sentence of 25 years in federal prison was met with quiet satisfaction from Sanders victims and civil rights advocates who had worked to expose his crimes. Sanders would be eligible for parole after serving 21 years, meaning he would likely remain in prison until his late 50s if he survived his incarceration. Sanders showed no visible emotion as the sentence was announced, though his family members in the gallery were visibly distraught at the confirmation that their husband and father would spend the next 2 decades behind bars while they struggled to rebuild their lives in the shadow of his crimes. Sanders' wife Jennifer wept quietly as the judge explained that her husband would be transferred to a federal prison facility within 30 days. Their children, who had been living with the stigma of their father's crimes for months, would now face the reality of growing up with an incarcerated parent who had become a symbol of police corruption. The family had lost their home, their savings, and their standing in the community as a result of Sanders' criminal behavior. Jennifer Sanders had been forced to find employment after years as a stay-at-home mother, while their children had been subjected to harassment and social isolation at school. Following the sentencing, Foster held a press conference outside the courthouse alongside civil rights attorneys and reform advocates who had supported his case and worked to implement systematic changes in police accountability. The moment represented not just personal vindication, but institutional recognition of the need for comprehensive reform. Justice has been served for Officer Sanders' crimes, Foster announced to the assembled media, standing confidently before a backdrop of federal courthouse columns. But our work is not finished. We must ensure that no other innocent person suffers the targeting and false accusations that I experienced, and that so many others have endured without the institutional support and technological evidence that saved my career and reputation. Foster's press conference was attended by representatives from major civil rights organizations, academic institutions, and reform advocacy groups who had supported his case and were using his experience to promote broader changes in police accountability and oversight. The American Civil Liberties Union's National Legal Director praised Foster's courage in fighting false charges and emphasized the importance of his case for understanding systematic police misconduct. Dr. Foster's vindication demonstrates that police corruption can be exposed and prosecuted when victims have the courage to fight back and communities have the wisdom to support truth over convenience. The AACP's Legal Defense Fund announced that Foster's case would be featured in a national campaign for police accountability legislation, using his experience to illustrate the need for enhanced oversight and technological solutions for detecting evidence tampering. Foster's transformation from victim to advocate had been gradual but complete, as he used his platform and credibility to promote evidence-based approaches to police reform and civil rights protection. His scientific background gave him unique authority in discussions about systematic approaches to preventing misconduct and protecting innocent people. The Criminal Justice Research Center that Foster had established at Millbrook University was already producing groundbreaking research on police accountability and evidence-based reform strategies. The center had received federal funding and attracted researchers from across the country who were developing technological and policy solutions to prevent police corruption. One of the center's first major projects was developing artificial intelligence systems that could analyze arrest patterns and identify potential misconduct before it resulted in wrongful convictions. The technology was being tested in several police departments that had volunteered to participate in pilot programs focused on accountability and transparency. The AI system analyzed factors such as arrest frequency, demographic patterns of suspects, evidence discovery rates, and case disposition outcomes to identify officers whose statistics deviated significantly from their peers. Early testing had successfully identified several officers whose behavior warranted closer supervision. Dr. Lisa Chen, the center's technology director, was leading the development of predictive analytics tools that could flag suspicious arrest patterns in real time. We're applying the same systematic thinking that Dr. Foster used in his molecular biology research to the problem of police accountability, she explained during a conference presentation. The center was also developing enhanced evidence handling protocols that used blockchain technology to create tamper-proof records of evidence collection and storage. The system would make it virtually impossible for officers to plant evidence without detection, while providing courts with reliable documentation of evidence authenticity. Foster's academic career had not only recovered from Sanders's attack, but had been enhanced by his experience and the national attention it had generated. He was being invited to speak at conferences, universities, and policy forums, where his combination of scientific expertise and personal experience with injustice provided unique insights into reform strategies. His speaking engagements included presentations at the National Academy of Sciences, the American Bar Association, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, where his message about evidence-based approaches to accountability was reaching audiences that could implement meaningful reforms. The molecular biology research that had been interrupted by his arrest was resuming with renewed energy and additional funding from organizations impressed by Foster's resilience and advocacy. His graduate students had continued their work during his legal ordeal and were now producing research that contributed to both scientific knowledge and social justice efforts. Sarah Chen, Foster's doctoral advisee, had completed her dissertation research and was planning to continue her studies in the intersection of science and criminal justice. Dr. Foster taught us that scientific principles of evidence and systematic investigation apply to social problems as well as molecular structures, she explained during her dissertation defense. Chen's research was focusing on the application of forensic science techniques to detect evidence tampering, building on the lessons learned from Foster's case to develop new methods for protecting the integrity of criminal investigations. The university had implemented the comprehensive reforms promised during Foster's ordeal, including enhanced legal support for faculty facing false accusations, expanded surveillance systems, and policies that prioritized truth-seeking over institutional protection. Foster's case had demonstrated the importance of standing behind community members who were targeted by external attacks. Dean Patricia Hawthorne had used Foster's case as a catalyst for broader discussions about academic freedom and institutional responsibility in supporting faculty members who faced external pressures related to their race, research, or advocacy. The university was becoming a model for other institutions seeking to protect their community members from false accusations and systematic targeting. The new policies included immediate legal support for faculty members facing criminal charges, enhanced security monitoring of campus facilities, and protocols for preserving evidence that could be relevant to defending community members against false accusations. The police department had undergone leadership changes and implemented the comprehensive reforms outlined during the crisis following Sanders's exposure. Chief of Police Maria Rodriguez, who had replaced the retired Chief Martinez, was focusing on rebuilding community trust through transparency, accountability, and evidence-based policing strategies. Chief Rodriguez had been recruited from a department in another state that was known for progressive policing practices and community engagement. Her appointment represented a clean break from the leadership that had failed to detect Sanders' crimes and allowed his misconduct to continue undetected. The Civilian Oversight Board, established in response to Sanders' crimes, was conducting regular audits of police arrests and evidence handling procedures, creating accountability mechanisms that made it difficult for future misconduct to operate undetected. The board included community representatives, legal experts, and civil rights advocates who brought external oversight to police operations. The Oversight Board's monthly reports were published online and included detailed statistics about arrest patterns, evidence discovery rates, and case dispositions that allowed community members to monitor police performance and identify potential problems before they resulted in wrongful convictions. Officer training programs had been completely revised to emphasize civil rights, ethical decision-making, and the devastating consequences of misconduct for both victims and the officers who committed crimes. Sanders' case was being used as a teaching example of how individual corruption could destroy entire careers and damage community relationships. The new training curriculum included extensive case studies of police misconduct and wrongful convictions, helping officers understand the real-world consequences of evidence tampering and false reporting. Officers were required to complete annual refresher training that included updates on accountability policies and legal developments. The federal investigation had ultimately identified 23 victims of Sanders' evidence, planting and false reporting, leading to the overturning of dozens of wrongful convictions and millions of dollars in compensation for people who had been imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. The scope of Sanders' crimes had been even broader than initially suspected. Each overturned conviction represented not just individual justice, but systematic acknowledgement that the criminal justice system had failed to protect innocent people from corrupt officers. The financial cost to taxpayers exceeded $30 million when legal settlements, investigation expenses, and reform implementation costs were combined. The financial impact had forced city leaders to confront the true cost of police misconduct and invest in prevention strategies that would be more cost-effective than continuing to pay settlements for wrongful convictions and civil rights violations. Foster's civil rights lawsuit against Sanders and the police department had been settled for $8 million, providing financial compensation for the damage to his career and reputation, while funding continued research into police accountability and reform strategies. The settlement included provisions for ongoing institutional changes that would prevent similar misconduct. The settlement funds were being used to expand the Criminal Justice Research Center and support scholarships for students from communities that had been disproportionately affected by police misconduct. Foster was transforming his personal injustice into broader opportunities for education and reform that would benefit future generations. Media coverage of Foster's case had evolved from local crime reporting to national discussions about racial justice, police accountability, and the power of institutional support in protecting innocent people from false accusations. Foster had become a recognizable voice in civil rights advocacy and criminal justice reform. Documentary filmmakers and book publishers were developing projects about Foster's case and its broader implications for understanding police corruption and community resilience. Foster was cooperating with these projects while maintaining his focus on academic research and practical reform strategies rather than personal celebrity. The surveillance technology that had exposed Sanders' crime was being adopted by institutions and organizations across the country as a model for protecting community members from false accusations and criminal targeting. Foster's case had demonstrated the crucial importance of comprehensive documentation in exposing misconduct and protecting innocent people. Security professionals were developing enhanced protocols for evidence preservation and chain of custody procedures that would make it easier to detect and prove evidence tampering in future cases. The technological lessons learned from Foster's case were being incorporated into training programs for law enforcement and security personnel. Foster's relationship with his family had been strengthened by their shared experience of surviving systematic attack and emerging stronger through community support and institutional solidarity. Elena Foster had returned to her surgical practice with renewed appreciation for the fragility of professional success and the importance of supporting colleagues facing external pressures. The couple was planning to establish a foundation focused on supporting families affected by police misconduct and wrongful accusations, providing both financial assistance and advocacy services for people who lacked the institutional support and resources that had enabled Foster's vindication. The foundation would focus particularly on supporting minority professionals who were targeted for false accusations, providing legal resources and community support that could help prevent wrongful convictions and minimize the damage from police misconduct. Foster's students continued to view him as both an academic mentor and a civil rights hero whose experience had demonstrated the importance of standing up for truth and evidence-based thinking in the face of systematic injustice. His classroom discussions frequently incorporated lessons about ethics, evidence, and the social responsibilities of scientific training. The molecular biology department had become a center for discussions about the intersection of science and social justice, with faculty and students exploring ways that scientific thinking could contribute to solving social problems and promoting fairness in institutional decision-making. Foster's research into the molecular structures that had originally defined his career was continuing alongside his advocacy work, demonstrating that personal experience with injustice could enhance rather than detract from scientific productivity and innovation. His published papers were being cited more frequently as his national profile brought attention to his scientific contributions. The annual conference of the American Association for the Advancement of Science had invited Foster to deliver a keynote address about the intersection of scientific thinking and civil rights advocacy. Recognizing his unique contributions to both fields, and his demonstration of how personal experience could inform broader social change efforts. Sanders, meanwhile, was beginning his long prison sentence in a federal facility, where his former status as a police officer made him a target for violence from other inmates who had been victimized by corrupt law enforcement. His daily reality was a stark contrast to the authority and respect he had once commanded as a police officer. The irony of Sanders's situation was not lost on observers who noted that he was experiencing the same criminal justice system that he had corrupted to destroy innocent lives. His treatment by other inmates reflected the community anger and distrust that his crimes had generated throughout his career. Sanders was being held in protective custody for his own safety, isolated from the general prison population in a way that mirrored the isolation his crimes had imposed on his victims. The 25-year sentence meant that he would likely spend the remainder of his productive years behind bars, unable to harm additional innocent people. Sanders' family was struggling to maintain connections with him, while rebuilding their own lives in a community that viewed them as symbols of police corruption and betrayal. His children were receiving counseling to help them process the reality that their father had deliberately destroyed innocent families through his criminal behavior. The psychological impact of Sanders' crimes extended beyond his immediate victims to the broader community that had lost trust in law enforcement and struggled to distinguish between honest officers and potential corrupt ones. Rebuilding community relationships would require years of consistent accountability and transparency. Foster's vindication had become a symbol of hope for communities that had experienced police misconduct without seeing justice served, demonstrating that systematic investigation and institutional support could expose even carefully planned corruption and hold perpetrators accountable for their crimes. The case was being studied by academics, policymakers, and reform advocates as an example of how technological evidence, community support, and institutional accountability could work together to protect innocent people and expose police corruption. Foster's experience was informing broader strategies for preventing similar injustices. As Foster looked toward the future, he saw opportunities to use his experience and platform to promote evidence-based approaches to criminal justice reform that could prevent other innocent people from suffering the targeting and false accusations that had temporarily destroyed his life before truth ultimately prevailed. His work was continuing with renewed purpose and expanded scope, demonstrating that personal injustice could be transformed into broader social change when victims had the courage to fight back and communities had the wisdom to support truth over convenience. Foster's vindication represented not just individual justice, but systematic proof that accountability could triumph over corruption when institutions chose to prioritize truth over protecting their own interests. The resolution of Foster's case marked not an ending, but a beginning of broader efforts to ensure that police officers like Sanders could never again use their authority to destroy innocent lives through evidence planting and false accusations. Foster's transformation from victim to advocate was inspiring others to demand accountability and work for justice in their own communities. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't see your true worth? Have you ever witnessed injustice that seemed protected by systems designed to avoid accountability? If this story resonated with you, share it. Don't let the lessons of prejudice and accountability be forgotten in the noise of daily life. If you're moved by stories that spark change and call for justice, hit subscribe. We've got plenty more powerful tales of truth and transformation coming your way, because sometimes it takes one person's courage to expose an entire system of corruption. Thank you for following this story to its conclusion. Every share, every comment, every subscription helps ensure that stories of accountability continue to be told when they matter most.